they, them pronouns, and I currently stand on the land of Lenape and Wappinger nations. It is such a joy to spend my Monday night with all of you. These times are weighing on us, and I don't take this lightly at all. I think it's a huge ask of someone to ask them to sit in front of a screen right now. And so thank you, this lightly at all. Let's begin quickly by just going around and sharing our names, sharing our pronouns, and as kind of something to consider. So during this quarantine, I've been seeing that a lot of people are having intense dreams. If this is true for you, I want to hear what you've been dreaming about. So I'll start first. Cheyenne, she, her, and they, them pronouns. I had a dream recently of someone that I have not spoken to in ages. And it was the weirdest thing because I was lucid in that dream. When I saw them, I was like, what are you doing here? Like, it was like IRL self was talking to dream self and was like able to actually have a conversation in that realm. It was trippy. It was wild.
I guess we're just popcorning?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Wow. Hey, y'all. I'm Shira, she and they pronouns. Similarly to Cheyenne, also have been having really intense dreams of people that I haven't talked to in years. Also lucid. I thought it was my melatonin, but I stopped taking it and I'm still fucking lucid. Still having the same dreams. So glad to know I'm not the only one in the same boat.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. My name is Nala, she, they pronouns, no preference. Yeah, I've been dreaming a lot recently. It's a lot of like repressed memories. I feel like just all this time alone, like my subconscious is more present. And yeah, I think a lot of things that I probably personally haven't worked through are coming up a lot in my dreams. So it's not always pleasant. Oh, and I'm from Toronto.
I'm Natalie. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Indianapolis. And usually, like, in non-quarantine life, I don't, like, either I don't dream or, like, I don't remember. But in the past, like, few weeks, I've had a dream about an abuser. And I've also had a dream about, like, having a child. So two very opposite ends of the spectrum, I guess, or maybe not. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Guyana from New York. What did I say? Oh, I use she, her pronouns. So in quarantine, I haven't had dreams, but my Haitian mother has. And she tells us every day what type of dreams she be having. So yes, I'm living vicariously through her. It's interesting. She had a dream about this girl who's sick, and lo and behold, her sister is sick. So yeah, her dreams are like pretty on point, I guess. I don't think I've been dreaming as much as I used to. But my mom works in psych also, and she was telling me that it's a real thing that there are more like heightened dreams because of especially patients who are recovering or who have COVID. A lot of her patients have been having scary dreams. So something to look into, I guess, after this.
Yeah,
I'm Jasmine. I use she, her pronouns. I'm here with Fufu. I don't usually dream, and I had one notable dream at the onset of quarantine, and I was trying to find my mom, and DMX helped me find my mom, the musician. And then he was just such a gentleman. Like, you guys, in the dream, I got so thirsty for DMX, which is not my reality because he's homophobic and trash. But in the dream, I was like, wow, like, he's not even trying anything. What a guy. And so then I was trying something because he wasn't trying something. And I think that truly foreshadowed the desperation and thirst to come from just like minimal decency with another human being. Yeah.
Hey y'all, I'm Brianna. My pronouns are they, she. My dreams haven't been, I have not been remembering them, but I've been remembering what I've been feeling in them. And I feel like I'm definitely in warrior mode and like very observant and very like low to the ground in almost all of my dreams.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe, and my pronouns are she, her. It's so interesting. Thank you for asking this, Cheyenne, because I had the weirdest dream. It was either last night or the night before last. I haven't been sleeping very well, and I had a dream. I work in a museum, and we're building a new building. And I had a dream that new building, frantically looking for something, and I didn't know what looking for. In the dream, I knew what I was looking for, but when I woke up, I don't know what I was looking for, but I was really trying to find it. And I was really upset because I kept going to everyone and saying, have you seen it? Have you seen it? And nobody seemed to really, and I just remember in the dream I was like really frustrated. So I have to unpack that, what that's about. But I woke up really angry and irritated, and then I was like, wait, none of this is real, so let me just take it down a notch.
Okay, I'm gonna try to go this time. Okay. Woo! Yay. Okay. My name is Alex. I use they, them pronouns. Yeah,
This is familiar
okay.
for me.
I'm gonna read that. Oh. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. I normally have very vivid dreams, and I dream all the time. I usually dream about people that I either will meet or do know, or people that I don't know in a different context. It's very community oriented a lot, and now I've been dreaming a little bit less, which is interesting. And I don't really remember much of my dreams either. It's kind of the same shit, honestly. I don't even know if I needed to. It's the same shit. But I think that walking out of it, I'm seeing how more on point these dreams tend to be about themes that we're exploring. I don't even really remember them though. Normally I can kind of remember them a little bit, but right now I can't. So yeah, okay, I'm reading the messages.
I'm Sin. I actually had a really vivid dream really recently. I realized like I smoke like pretty much every day. So like if I don't smoke for like 1-2 days, either the first or second day, like I dream a little more. And generally I haven't been. But really recently I had a pretty bad dream that like woke me up out of like in like terror. and I like had to get up in the middle of the night just to like let it go. So it's interesting that that's the conversation that's happening now, because I had realized that I had stopped dreaming often, and then just recently via some like family shit that popped up recently, so that sort of was what the dream was enwrapped in. So interesting.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, cool. Hi, I'm Duneska. My pronouns are she, her. Like other people, I mean, I usually dream very vividly. Usually it's like with like people that I know, same as like Alex. Yeah, but I didn't notice until a few days ago that I actually like haven't been dreaming at all, which is like really interesting. Like I just like haven't like whatsoever. Like I couldn't even tell you guys. And like often I remember my dreams to the point of like I think that they're real. Like I'll wake up having to tell myself that they aren't real, you know? Except for a few days ago. I don't know if anyone has watched the movie The Nightmare. It's really fucked up. It's like about people that have fuck, what is the name? It's like sleep I don't know. Basically it's when you like see like shadows when you're like asleep and they like feel like they're coming to attack you and you're like paralyzed. And sleep paralysis. Yes, thank you. Yes. So yeah, I watched that movie, The Nightmare, and I was like actively trying to not have sleep paralysis. Like I was scared I was gonna get it. So I was like dreaming about sleep paralysis, trying not to have sleep paralysis, like just freaking out. But yeah. I'm like, that's my experience. Where's my 12th house? I don't know. I'm gonna find out.
What's your rising sign?
Rising Leo.
12th house is in Cancer.
Oh shit. I'm like, cool.
Cool. Thank you to all who shared. For folks who would feel more comfortable sharing in the chat, feel free to do so. I know there are folks who are witnessing all of the dreams and holding space within the chat, so definitely feel free to share them there. Or if not, just continue to work through them during this time with someone you trust. So this session is really meant to bring in some time at the end of our days to slow our minds, wind down, relax, reflect, and listen. And it's also meant to help us make that transition from being online in front of a screen to AFK, away from keyboard. So this is pretty much going to be a story time for adults. Originally, I had planned to give us all prompts for free writing and journaling, and then I was planning on kind of hopping from different texts, but I think what I'm being called to do is do something a lot more simple. And so tonight I'm going to read a short story by the legendary, visionary science fiction writer, Octavia Butler. For people who would be interested in free writing and journaling, though, I'm happy to share those prompts in the chat later. But tonight's story is Speech Sounds by Octavia Butler. I'm going to go ahead and find the PDF in case there are folks who would like to read along. I'm going to plug that in right there. But basically, you can feel free to participate in any way that you'd like. So if that means sitting somewhere comfortable or lying somewhere comfortable, you're free to do that. You can continue to listen as you wrap up your errands, as you move towards the end of the day. But yeah. So back to Speech Sounds and Octavia Butler. For folks into astrology, Octavia was born in Pasadena, California, on June 22nd, 1947, making her a Cancer sun. And she passed in 2006 at the age of 58, very young. Tonight's story is one of several short stories published by Octavia. It's called Speech Sounds, first published in 1983 in a science fiction magazine, and then later as part of Octavia's anthology, Blood Child, and other short stories, which is a great anthology. It includes some of Octavia's personal essays that are amazing. And if you ever have an opportunity to check this out, please do. Speech Sounds explores a lot of the themes that we know to characterize Octavia's work. We, as an audience, witness the aftermath of an apocalyptic event that has transformed society. Because for Octavia, there is always life after an apocalypse. The characters who lead us into this world and survive are not able-bodied, but live with conditions that make them, quote, other from the people around them. In this case, it's a virus that has dramatically changed society, and the condition is aphasia, which is the loss of ability to understand or express speech. Nonverbal communication and gesture play very prominently in this story. You can really see Octavia grapple with means of communications between human beings as she writes. I am so excited to read a story for you all by Octavia Butler. I sincerely hope you enjoy it. So if you're ready, let's settle in. Place one hand on your heart, place the other on your abdomen, and we're going to take a deep breath. And on the exhale, I want you to let it all go. So inhale and exhale. One more time. Inhale and exhale. Yeah. All right. Here we go. Speech Sounds by Octavia Butler. There was trouble aboard the Washington Boulevard bus. Rye had expected trouble sooner or later in her journey. She had put off going until loneliness and hopelessness drove her out. She believed she might have one group of relatives left alive, a brother and his 2 children 20 miles away in Pasadena. That was a day's journey one way if she were lucky. The unexpected arrival of the bus as she left her Virginia road home has seemed to be a piece of luck, until the trouble began. 2 young men were involved in a disagreement of some kind, or more likely, a misunderstanding. They stood in the aisle, grunting and gesturing at each other, each in his own uncertain T-stance as the bus lurched over the potholes. The driver seemed to be putting some effort into keeping them off balance. Still, their gestures stopped just short of contact. Mock punches, hand games of intimidation to replace lost curses. People watched the pair, then looked at one another and made small, anxious sounds. 2 children whimpered. Rye sat a few feet behind the disputants and across from the back door. She watched the 2 carefully, knowing the fight would begin when someone's nerve broke, or someone's hand slipped, or someone came to the end of his limited ability to communicate. These things could happen anytime. One of them happened as the bus hit an especially large pothole, and one man, tall, thin, and sneering, was thrown into his shorter opponent. Instantly, the shorter man drove his left fist into the disintegrating sneer. He hammered his larger opponent as though he neither had nor needed any weapon other than his left fist. He hit quickly enough, hard enough to batter his opponent down before the taller man could regain his balance or hit back even once. People screamed or squawked in fear. Those nearby scrambled to get out of the way. 3 more young men roared in excitement and gestured wildly. Then, somehow, a second dispute broke out between 2 of these 3, probably because one inadvertently touched or hit the other. As the second fight scattered the frightened passengers, a woman shook the driver's shoulder and grunted as she gestured towards the fighting. The driver grunted back through bare teeth. Frightened, the woman drew away. Rai, knowing the methods of bus drivers, braced herself and held on to the crossbar of the seat in front of her. When the driver hit the brakes, she was ready, and the combatants were not. They fell over seats and onto screaming passengers, creating even more confusion. At least one more fight started. The instant the bus came to a full stop, Rai was on her feet, pushing the back door. At the second push, it opened and she jumped out, holding her pack in one arm. Several other passengers followed, but some stayed on the bus. Buses were so rare and irregular now. People rode when they could, no matter what. There might not be another bus today or tomorrow. People started walking, and if they saw a bus, they flagged it down. People making intercity trips like Rai's from Los Angeles to Pasadena made plans to camp out or risked seeking shelter with locals who might rob or murder them. The bus did not move, but Rai moved away from it. She intended to wait until the trouble was over and get on again. But if there was a shooting, she wanted the protection of a tree. Thus, she was near the curb when a battered blue Ford on the other side of the street made a U-turn and pulled up in front of the bus. Cars were rare these days, as rare as a severe shortage of fuel and of relatively unimpaired mechanics could make them. Cars that still ran were as likely to be used as weapons as they were to serve as transportation. Thus, when the driver of the Ford beckoned to Rai, she moved away, warily. The driver got out, a big man, young, neatly bearded, with dark, thick hair. He wore a long overcoat and a look of wariness that matched Rai's. She stood, several feet from him, waiting to see what he would do. He looked at the bus, now rocking with the combat inside, then at the small cluster of passengers who had gotten off. Finally, he looked at Rai again. She returned his gaze, very much aware of the old .45 automatic her jacket concealed. She watched his hands. He pointed with his left hand toward the bus. The dark-tinted windows prevented him from seeing what was happening inside. His use of the left hand interested Rai more than his obvious question. Left-handed people tended to be less impaired, more reasonable and comprehending, less driven by frustration, confusion, and anger. She imitated his gesture, pointing toward the bus with her own left hand, then punching the air with both fists. The man took off his coat, revealing a Los Angeles Police Department uniform, complete with baton and service revolver. Rai took another step back from him. There was no more LAPD, no more any large organization, governmental or private. There were only neighborhood patrols and armed individuals. That was all. The man took something from his coat pocket, then threw the coat into the car. Then he gestured Rai back toward the rear of the bus. He had something made of plastic in his hand. Rai did not understand what he wanted until he went to the rear door of the bus and beckoned her to stand there. She obeyed, mainly out of curiosity. Cop or not, maybe he could do something to stop the stupid fighting. He walked around the front of the bus to the street side where the driver's window was open. There, she thought, she saw him throw something into the bus. She was still trying to peer through the tinted glass when people began stumbling out the rear door, choking and weeping. Gas. Rai caught an old woman who would have fallen, lifted two little children down when they were in danger of being knocked down and trampled. She could see the bearded man helping people at the front door. She caught a thin old man shoved out by one of the combatants. Staggered by the old man's weight, she was barely able to get out of the way as the last of the young men pushed his way out. This one, bleeding from nose and mouth, stumbled into another, and they grappled blindly, still sobbing from the gas. The bearded man helped the bus driver out through the front door, though the driver did not seem to appreciate his help. For a moment, Rye thought there would be another fight. The bearded man stepped back and watched the driver gesture threateningly, watched him shout in wordless anger. The bearded man stood still, made no sound, refused to respond to clearly obscene gestures. The least impaired people tended to do this, stand back unless they were physically threatened, and let those with less control scream and jump around. It was as though they felt it beneath them to be as touchy as the less comprehending. This was an attitude of superiority, and that was the way people like the bus driver perceived it. Such, quote, superiority was frequently punished by beatings, even by death. Raya had close calls of her own. Raya had close calls of her own. As a result, she never went unarmed. And in this world, where the only likely common language was body language, being armed was often enough. She had rarely had to draw her gun or even display it. The bearded man's revolver was on constant display. Apparently, that was enough for the bus driver. The driver spat in disgust, glared at the bearded man for a moment longer, then strode back to his gas-filled bus. He stared at it for a moment, clearly wanting to get in, but the gas was still too strong. Of the windows, only his tiny driver's window actually opened. The front door was open, but the rear door would not stay open unless someone held it. Of course, the air conditioning had failed long ago. The bus would take some time to clear. It was the driver's property, his livelihood. He had pasted old magazine pictures of items he would accept as fare on its sides. Then he would use what he collected to feed his family or to trade. If his bus did not run, he did not eat. On the other hand, if the inside of his bus was torn apart by senseless fighting, he would not eat very well either. He was apparently unable to perceive this. All he could see was that it would be some time before he could use his bus again. He shook his fist at the bearded man and shouted. There seemed to be words in his shout, but Raya could not understand them. She did not know whether this was his fault or hers. Thank you. Have a good night. She was no longer certain how well she recognized it, no longer certain of the degree of her own impairment. The bearded man sighed. He glanced toward his car, then beckoned to Rye. He was ready to leave, but he wanted something from her first. No, he wanted her to leave with him. Risk getting into his car when, in spite of his uniform, law and order were nothing, not even words any longer. She shook her head in a universally understood negative, but the man continued to beckon. She waved him away. He was doing what the less impaired rarely did, drawing potentially negative attention to another of his kind. People from the bus had begun to look at her. One of the men who had been fighting tapped another on the arm, then pointed from the bearded man to Rye, and finally held up the first 2 fingers of his right hand, as though giving 2/3 of a Boy Scout salute. The gesture was quick, its meaning obvious even at a distance. She had been grouped with the bearded man. Now what? The man who made the gesture started toward her. She had no idea what he intended, but stood her ground. The man was half a foot taller than she was, and perhaps 10 years younger. She did not imagine she could outrun him, nor did she expect anyone to help her if she needed help. The people around her were all strangers. She gestured once, a clear indication to the man to stop. She did not intend to repeat the gesture. Fortunately, the man obeyed. He gestured obscenely, and several other men laughed. Loss of verbal language had spawned a whole new set of obscene gestures. The man, with stark simplicity, had accused her of sex with the bearded man and had suggested she accommodate the other men present, beginning with him. Rai watched him warily. People might very well stand by and watch if he tried to rape her. They would also stand and watch her shoot him. Would he push things that far? He did not. After a series of obscene gestures that brought him no closer to her, he turned contemptuously and walked away. And the bearded man still waited. He had removed his service revolver, holster and all. He beckoned again, both hands empty. No doubt his gun was in the car and within easy reach, but his taking it off impressed her. Maybe he was all right. Maybe he was just alone. She had been alone herself for 3 years. The illness had stripped her, killing her children one by one, killing her husband, her sister, her parents. The illness, if it was an illness, had cut even the living off from one another. As it swept over the country, people hardly had time to lay blame on the Soviets, though they were falling silent along with the rest of the world on a new virus, a new pollutant, radiation, divine retribution. The illness was stroke swift in the way it cut people down and stroke-like in some of its effects, but it was highly specific. Language was always lost or severely impaired. It was never regained. Often, there was also paralysis, intellectual impairment, death. Rai walked toward the bearded man, ignoring the whistling and applauding of 2 of the young men and their thumbs-up signs to the bearded man. If he had smiled at them or acknowledged them in any way, she would almost certainly have changed her mind. If she had let herself think of the possible deadly consequences of getting into a stranger's car, she would have changed her mind. Instead, she thought of the man who lived across the street from her. He rarely washed since his bout with the illness, and he had gotten into the habit of urinating wherever he happened to be. He had 2 women already, one tending each of his large gardens. They put up with him in exchange for his protection. He had made it clear that he wanted Rai to become his 3rd woman. She got into the car and the bearded man shut the door. She watched as he walked around to the driver's door, watched for his sake because his gun was on the seat beside her, and the bus driver and a pair of young men had come a few steps closer. They did nothing, though, until the bearded man was in his car. Then, one of them threw a rock. Others followed his example, and as the car drove away, several rocks bounced off harmlessly. When the bus was some distance behind them, Rai wiped sweat from his forehead and longed to relax. The bus would have taken her more than halfway to Pasadena. She would have had only 10 miles to walk. She wondered how far she would have to walk now, and wondered if walking a long distance would be her only problem. As Figueroa in Washington, where the bus normally made a left turn, the bearded man stopped, looked at her, and indicated that she would choose a direction. When she directed him left and he actually turned left, she began to relax. If he was willing to go where she directed, perhaps he was safe. As they passed blocks of burned, abandoned buildings, empty lots, and wrecked or stripped cars, he slipped a gold chain over his head and handed it to her. The pendant attached to it was a smooth, glassy black rock, Obsidian. His name might be Rock, or Peter, or Black, but she decided to think of him as Obsidian. Even her sometimes useless memory would retain a name like Obsidian. She handed him her own name symbol, a pin in the shape of a large golden stalk of wheat. She had bought it long before the illness and the silence began. Now she wore it, thinking it was as close as she was likely to come to Rai. People like Obsidian, who had not known her before, probably thought of her as wheat. Not that it mattered. She would never hear her name spoken again. Obsidian handed her pin back to her. He caught her hand as she reached for it and rubbed his thumb over her calluses. He stopped at First Street and asked, which way again? Then, after turning right as she had indicated, he parked near the music center. There, he took a folded paper from the dashboard and unfolded it. Rai recognized it as a street map, though the writing on it meant nothing to her. He flattened the map, took her hand again, and put her index finger on one spot. He touched her, touched himself, pointed toward the floor. In effect, we are here. She knew he wanted to know where she was going. She wanted to tell him, but she shook her head sadly. She had lost reading and writing. That was her most serious impairment and her most painful. She had taught history at UCLA. She had done freelance writing. Now she could not even read her own manuscripts. She had a house full of books that she could neither read nor bring herself to use as fuel. And she had a memory that would not bring back to her much of what she had read before. She stared at the map, trying to calculate. She had been born in Pasadena, had lived for 15 years in LA. Now she was near LA Civic Center. She knew the relative positions of the two cities, knew streets, directions, even knew to stay away from freeways, which might be blocked by wrecked cars and destroyed overpasses. She ought to know how to point out Pasadena, even though she could not recognize the word. Hesitantly, she placed her hand over a pale orange patch in the upper right corner of the map. That should be right. Pasadena. Obsidian lifted her hand and looked under it, then folded the map and put it back on the dashboard. He could read, she realized belatedly. He could probably write too. Abruptly, she hated him. Deep, bitter hatred. What did literacy mean to him, a grown man who played cops and robbers? But he was literate, and she was not. She never would be. She felt sick to her stomach with hatred, frustration, and jealousy, and only a few inches from her hand was a loaded gun. She held herself still, staring at him, almost seeing his blood, but her rage crested and ebbed, and she did nothing. Obsidian reached for her hand with hesitant familiarity. She looked at him. Her face had already revealed too much. No person still living in what was left of human society could fail to recognize that expression, that jealousy. She closed her eyes wearily, drew a deep breath. She had experienced longing for the past, hatred of the present, growing helplessness, growing hopelessness, purposelessness, but she had never experienced such a powerful urge to kill another person. She had left her home finally because she had come near to killing herself. She had found no reason to stay alive. Perhaps that was why she had gotten into Obsidian's car. She had never before done such a thing. He touched her mouth and made chatter motions with thumb and fingers. Could she speak? She nodded and watched his milder envy come and go. Now both had admitted what was not safe to admit, and there had been no violence. He tapped his mouth and forehead and shook his head. He did not speak or comprehend spoken language. The illness had played with them, taking away, she suspected, what each valued most. She plucked at his sleeve, wondering why he had decided on his own to keep the LAPD alive with what he had left. He was sane enough otherwise. Why wasn't he at home raising corn, rabbits, and children? But she did not know how to ask. Then he put his hand on her thigh, and she had another question to deal with. She shook her head. Disease, pregnancy, helpless, solitary agony. No. He massaged her thigh gently and smiled in obvious disbelief. No one had touched her for 3 years. She had not wanted anyone to touch her. What kind of world was this to chance bringing a child into, even if the father were willing to stay and help raise it. It was too bad, though. Obsidian could not know how attractive he was to her. Young, probably younger than she was, asking for what he wanted rather than demanding it. But none of that mattered. What were a few moments of pleasure measured against a lifetime of consequences? He pulled her closer to him, and for a moment she let herself enjoy the closeness. He smelled good, male and good. She pulled away, reluctantly. He sighed, reached toward the glove compartment. She stiffened, not knowing what to expect. But all he took out was a small box. The writing on it meant nothing to her. She did not understand until he broke the seal, opened the box, and took out a condom. He looked at her, and she first looked away in surprise. And then she giggled. She could not remember when she had last giggled. He grinned, gestured toward the back seat, and she laughed aloud. Even in her teens, she had disliked back seats of cars. But she looked around at the empty streets and ruined buildings. Then she got out and into the back seat. He let her put the condom on him, and then seemed surprised at her eagerness. Sometime later, they sat together, covered by his coat, unwilling to become clothed near strangers again just yet. He made rock the baby gestures and looked questioningly at her. She swallowed, shook her head. She did not know how to tell him her children were dead. He took her hand and drew a cross in it with his index finger, then made his baby rocking gesture again. She nodded, held up 3 fingers, then turned away, trying to shut out a sudden flood of memories. She had told herself that the children growing up now were to be pitied. They would run through the downtown canyons with no real memory of what the buildings had been or even how they had come to be. Today's children gathered books as well as wood to be burned as fuel. They ran through the streets, chasing one another and hooting like chimpanzees. They had no future. They were now all they ever would be. He put his hand on her shoulder, and she turned suddenly, fumbling for his small box, then urging him to make love to her again. He could give her forgetfulness and pleasure. Until now, nothing had been able to do that. Until now, every day had brought her closer to the time when she would do what she had left home to avoid doing. She asked Obsidian if he would come home with her, stay with her. He looked surprised and pleased once he understood, but he did not answer at once. Finally, he shook his head as she had feared he might. He was probably having too much fun playing cops and robbers and picking up women. She dressed in silent disappointment, unable to feel any anger toward him. Perhaps he already had a wife and a home. That was likely. The illness had been harder on men than on women, had killed more men, had left male survivors more severely impaired. Men like Obsidian were rare. Women either settled for less or stayed alone. If they found an Obsidian, they did what they could to keep him. Rye suspected he had someone younger, prettier, keeping him. He touched her while she was strapping her gun on and asked with a complicated series of gestures whether it was loaded. She nodded grimly. He patted her arm. She asked once more if he would come home with her, this time using a different series of gestures. He had seemed hesitant, perhaps he could be courted. He got out and into the front seat without responding. She took her place in front again, watching him, now plucked at his uniform and looked at her. She thought she was being asked something, but did not know what it was. He took off his badge and tapped it with one finger, then tapped his chest. Of course. She took the badge from his hand and pinned her wheat stalk to it. If playing cops and robbers was his only insanity, let him play. She would take him, uniform and all. It occurred to her that she might eventually lose him to someone he would meet as he had met her, but she would have him for a while. He took the street map down again, tapped it, pointed vaguely northeast toward Pasadena, then looked at her. She shrugged, tapped his shoulder, then her own, and held up her index and second fingers tight together, just to be sure. He grasped the 2 fingers and nodded. He was with her. She took the map from him and threw it onto the dashboard. She pointed back southwest, back toward home. Now she did not have to go to Pasadena. Now she could go on having a brother there and 2 nephews, 3 right-handed males. Now she did not have to find out for certain whether she was as alone as she feared. Now she was not alone. Obsidian took Hill Street south, then Washington west, and she leaned back, wondering it would be like to have someone again, with what she had scavenged, with what she had preserved, and what she grew. There was easily enough food for them. There was certainly room for them enough in a 4-bedroom house. He could move his possessions in. Best of all, the animal across the street would pull back and possibly not force her to kill him. Obsidian had drawn herself closer to him. She had put her head on his shoulder, and suddenly he braked hard, almost throwing her off the seat. At the corner of her eye, she saw that someone had run across the street in front of the car. 1 car on the street, and someone had to run in front of it. Straightening up, Rye saw that the runner was a woman, fleeing from an old frame house to a boarded-up storefront. She ran silently, but the man who followed her a moment later shouted what sounded like garbled words as he ran. He had something in his hand. Not a gun. A knife, perhaps. The woman tried a door, found it locked, looked around desperately, finally snatched up a fragment of glass broken from the storefront window. With this, she turned to face her pursuer. Rye thought she would be more likely to cut her own hand than to hurt anyone else with the glass. Obsidian jumped from the car, shouting. It was the first time Rye had heard his voice, deep and hoarse from disuse. He made the same sound over and over, the way some speechless people did. Da, da, da. Rye got out of the car as Obsidian ran toward the couple. He had drawn his gun. Fearful, she drew her own and released the safety. She looked around to see who else might be attracted to the scene. She saw the man glance up at Obsidian, then suddenly lunge at the woman. The woman jabbed his face with her glass, but he caught her arm and managed to stab her twice before Obsidian shot him. The man doubled over, then toppled, clutching his abdomen. Obsidian shouted, then gestured Rye over to help the woman. Rye moved to the woman's side, remembering that she had little more than bandages and antiseptic in her pack. But the woman was beyond help. She had been stabbed with a long, slender, boning knife. She touched Obsidian to let him know the woman was dead. He had bent to check the wounded man who lay still and also seemed dead. But as Obsidian looked around to see what Rye wanted, the man opened his eyes. Face contorted, he seized Obsidian's just holstered revolver and fired. The bullet caught Obsidian in the temple and he collapsed. It happened just that simply, just that fast. An instant later, Rye shot the wounded man as he was turning the gun on her. And Rye was alone with 3 corpses. She knelt beside Obsidian, dry-eyed, frowning, trying to understand why everything had suddenly changed. Obsidian was gone. He had died and left her, like everyone else. 2 very small children came out of the house from which the man and woman had run. A boy and girl, perhaps 3 years old. Holding hands, they crossed the street toward Rye. They stared at her, then edged past her and went to the dead woman. The girl shook the woman's arm as though trying to wake her. This was too much. Rye got up, feeling sick to her stomach with grief and anger. If the children began to cry, she thought she would vomit. They were on their own, those 2 kids. They were old enough to scavenge. She did not need any more grief. She did not need a stranger's children who would grow up to be hairless chimps. She went back to the car. She could drive home at least. She remembered how to drive. The thought that Obsidian should be buried occurred to her before she reached the car, and she did vomit. She had found and lost the man so quickly, it was as though she had been snatched from comfort and security and given a sudden, inexplicable beating. Her head would not clear. She could not think. Somehow, she made herself go back to him, look at him. She found herself on her knees beside him with no memory of having knelt. She stroked his face, his beard. One of the children made a noise and she looked at them, at the woman who was probably their mother. The children looked back at her, obviously frightened. Perhaps it was their fear that reached her finally. She had been about to drive away and leave them. She had almost done it, almost left 2 toddlers to die. Sure, there had been enough dying. She would have to take the children home with her. She would not be able to live with any other decision. She looked around for a place to bury 3 bodies, or 2. She wondered if the murderer were the children's father. Before the silence, the police had always said some of the most dangerous calls they went out on were domestic disturbance calls. Obsidian should have known that, not that the knowledge would have kept him in the car. It would not have held her back either. She could not have watched the woman murdered and done nothing. She dragged Obsidian toward the car. She had nothing to dig with her, and no one to guard for her while she dug. Better to take the bodies with her and bury them next to her children and her husband. Obsidian would come home with her after all. When she had gotten him onto the floor in the back, she returned for the woman. The little girl, thin, dirty, solemn, stood up and unknowingly gave Rai a gift. As Rai began to drag the woman by her arms, the little girl screamed, "No!" Rai dropped the woman and stared at the girl. "No," the girl repeated. She came to stand beside the woman. "Go away," she told Rai. "Don't talk," the little boy said to her. There were no blurring or confusing of sounds. Both children had spoken, and Rai had understood. The boy looked at the dead murderer and moved further from him. He took the girl's hand. "Be quiet," he whispered. Fluent speech. Had the woman died because she could talk and had taught her children to talk? Had she been killed by a husband's festering anger or by a stranger's jealous rage? And the children, they must have been born after the silence. Had the disease run its course then? Or were these children simply immune? Certainly they had had time to fall sick and silent. Rai's mind leaped ahead. What if children of 3 or fewer years were safe and able to learn language? What if all they needed were teachers and protectors? Rai glanced at the dead murderer. To her shame, she thought she could understand some of the passions that must have driven him, whomever he was. Anger, frustration, hopelessness, insane jealousy. How many more of him were there? People willing to destroy what they could not have. Obsidian had been the protector, had chosen that role for who knew what reason. Perhaps putting on an obsolete uniform and patrolling the empty streets had been what he did instead of putting a gun into his mouth. And now that there was something worth protecting, he was gone. She had been a teacher, a good one. She had been a protector too, though only of herself. She had kept herself alive when she had no reason to live. If the illness let these children alone, she could keep them alive. Somehow she lifted the dead woman into her arms and placed her on the back seat of the car. The children began to cry, but she knelt onto the broken pavement and whispered to them, fearful of frightening them with the harshness of her long unused voice. "It's all right," she told them. "You're going with us too. Come on." She lifted them both, one in each arm. They were so light. Had they been getting enough to eat? The boy covered her mouth with his hand, but she moved her face away. "It's all right for me to talk," she told him. "As long as no one's around, it's all right." She put the boy down on the front seat of the car, and he moved over without being told to make room for the girl. When they were both in the car, Rai leaned against the window, looking at them, seeing that they were less afraid now, that they watched her with at least as much curiosity as fear. "I'm Valerie Rai," she said, savoring the words. "It's all right for you to talk to me." Science fiction can be difficult when we're living it. The worlds Octavia writes about never feel too far off from our realities. This story was inspired by a fight that Octavia witnessed on a bus ride to see a friend. And it just left her feeling so depressed, so hopeless with the human species, as she wrote in the afterword, feeling little hope in humanity and wondering if people would ever stop using their fists to speak to one another. But hope arrives at the end of the story in the form of talk as a medicine to years of silence. Thank you all so much for actively listening, for taking this time for yourselves to rest or to prepare rest. We have another week ahead of us, and I hope that this gave you a pace reset to endure what all the uncertainty that's ahead. Oh yes, and the writing prompts. Thank you all so much. Thank you. This is so sweet. Let me share the writing prompts now. Okay. So the first question. Where in your life are you growing? And where are you struggling? The second question. What is one thing people fail to see about you? Okay. I will leave you with that offering. Thank you, Bufu, for allowing me to do this and to participate in community in this way. I love the cat. Whose cat is that?
This is Atticus. They use all pronouns because sometimes go by Caddy.
Hi, Caddy. Do folks want to share anything about what the story might have brought up for them before we sign off?
This is something that comes up a lot for me when I read Octavia Butler or like try to read her work, which is that it feels so close to reality that like I often struggle with like staying with it. I've been trying to read Parable of the Sower for so long now, and the farthest I've gotten was maybe a couple of months ago. I got to like halfway through the book. But I am so interested in her work and have heard so much about like how she's such a visionary science fiction writer. I guess I'm wondering if like other people feel similarly, and like what do you do to like stay present and stay with her? Because I think there are a lot of lessons that I could learn. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to affirm what you said. I remember reading Parable of the Sower, or started reading when I first started reading it, and I had to put it down because there was just so much despair. And I was thinking of reading it as part of this session, but I was like, damn, this is way too close to home right now, and I don't think we can do that. And so I instead opted for a short story where, you know, instead of maybe 200 pages getting to that hopefulness that she always brings at the end, we can get it in 5 or 6. And so I think that could be a way to kind of measure our own emotional capacities when reading Butler, maybe starting with some of her shorter stories, or turning to her personal essays, and then going on to those longer form novels.
Hi, everybody. Okay. Well, my name is Siri. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm a huge Octavia Butler fan. So I think it helped that I've read this previously before and it was interesting to hear it. I think maybe if I also read visually along with the PDF, that could have helped me a bit, because I picked up on things just through just hearing it. And but yeah, I think that basically it's really interesting how voice and communication is basically what is the illness takes over from people. And I think a positive is that we definitely, I mean, in the time of coronavirus, have the internet, have networks and platforms like this to use our voice, let it be heard. And so luckily, while you still have your voice, use it, is basically what I'm trying to say there. But I do think it's interesting how, in a similar way, I'm originally from New York. I'm on the West Coast right now. I don't know when the next time I can see my family is. And that's my experience with coronavirus. In a similar way, in this story, Octavia Butler, basically cuts off people's ability to really connect as they knew it. And so I think that, it being a short story, it's just a snapshot of kind of that experience as well. So maybe it might feel gloomy or kind of tragic, but I think that I've been able to take positive lessons and messages from her works in terms of collectively organizing and things like this. I think is a huge testament to what I think she would have wanted to happen. So that's my piece.
Yeah, I also wanted to offer something up because she is fantastic about writing in a way that conjures images in people's heads. And I feel like that's why the parable of the sower and the parable of the talents are so difficult to go through, just because you're reading it and feeling and being there all at the same time. But I thought it was really interesting that she names the man Obsidian, because Obsidian as a stone, it conjures up pieces of a person's dark side and the darkness that exists in all of us. And it's also a strong psychic protection stone. So I thought it was interesting that she randomly bumps into him and he's this protector, and she's in this really dark space because she's obviously suicidal. And it also apparently stimulates with the gift of prophecy. So when she got to the point of meeting the kids and they finally spoke to her, she starts to think about their future and just how she can help them survive so that they can also teach her I guess how to learn language and be able to teach them. And even just the idea of other toddlers after the sickness being born, probably with the gift of speech, it kind of flips the whole story on its ass, really. And it just brings you to the power of human beings being able to find pieces of innovation, of sanity, of mutual aid in the most fucked up situations and circumstances. So this was definitely spot on to read right now. It did feel a little bit depressing because that's kind of what she does with language, but at the end of it, it's like, oh, okay, this is what you mean. So I think we should take those lessons, or we could find them.
Yes, I'm going to read some of the comments in the chat. So T writes, she found her voice again in the end, which was such a powerful element and allegory in the story. And Alex, they wrote, Obsidian is also a transmutator of negative energy a lot of times too.
Yeah.
Hey.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to both of those points. Like, it's crazy because I've been avoiding Parabel Lesueur
Hey,
for so long.
What's your name?
I'm Chris Cologne. Pronouns he and him. And I think like the theme in like that book, and also the lovely reading you shared was this idea of family and community, and like how individually we think of family and community as something that's like a safe space or something that's familiar to us. So and like, well, Octavia Butler sometimes to me challenges me to think about just like what family and community means outside my comfort zone, and looking at different ways or strategies to like sometimes connect with people that you might seem unlikely to pair with. And even though sometimes it's depressing, I think it usually ends off with like a aha moment. And to T's point, like just for Rye to like begin speaking and understanding, it was like wow. So that's what I got from the reading.
So let's end there. Let's end on this note of alternative structures of community and family, which we're all practicing in this very moment. Again, I am so grateful to all of you for participating in this offering. Have a good night, y'all. And I don't know if Bufu, if y'all want to shout out any upcoming things for the week, any things you're excited about?
Yeah, I feel like so activated and soothed after your reading and all this conversation. I was like, yeah, I'm literally in bed. I started in a chair, and now I'm so thank you for so lovingly holding this space. Yeah, y'all, we out here another week. There's a calendar. If you haven't gone to cloud9.support, you can see what's coming up for the next couple of days. But we just shared out that we're going to be doing a vigil on Wednesday. So we just posted that today. And so if anyone's interested in participating in that, we're trying to craft it with community. Please, please message us and take a look at all the things. It's really good to see everybody. Love all of you, and really grateful to this space again. This is, it feels really, really nice to be held in this way. So thank you. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cheyenne.
Thank you. I've burned through all my podcasts weeks ago, so it's really nice to have your voice just reading to us. It feels much better and more connected than coronavirus podcast content. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all. See you soon.